Hello, this is the video for Carrie's DMin project on Eucharist and playfulness, and this is the Communion, Sacraments, Ecclesiology, and the United Church of Canada video. As one of two sacraments in the United Church of Canada, the Eucharist is important to faith formation and lifelong discipleship. While communion is not celebrated weekly in most United churches, the table is still at the center of our theology. In my conversations with colleagues and the ministry-based team who journeys through the D-Ministry program with me, I discovered that many congregants and clergy actually dread Communion Sunday. Communion has lost its celebratory power and is often performed robotically and reluctantly. I believe that a more playful approach to God and this ritual has the potential to make this practice more life-giving to both officiants and congregants. In the United Church, this is possible because we believe in something called ordered liberty, which allows the possibility for more flexibility and playfulness when we gather at the table. Order and liberty allow for historical substance and freshness in Eucharistic praying that appropriates the best of Christian liturgical tradition and language for our time. It allows the Eucharist to become truly feast and celebration through creativity, freedom, contextualization, and a flexible structure. And it can help us reclaim the freedom and celebration of the early church expressions of table fellowship that were talked about in an author called Marie-Therese Winter. Celebrating the Eucharist is a varied experience in the United Church of Canada because of our denominational polity. Our national body, our national body, the General Council, sets policy, creates and approves statements of faith, and provides resources for worship in congregational bodies. But they do not have the authority to decide what happens in local congregational settings for worship. It allows for local congregations to have jurisdiction over their worship matters, which means that there is a lot of diversity in the performance and celebrating at table in terms of the solemnity, the theology, and the frequency in which congregations share in communion, as well as all other aspects of the ritual. Before we can begin to expand our thinking about the ritual of the Eucharist, it would be helpful to understand more about the United Church of Canada's thinking on table fellowship through an exploration of the denomination's published documents regarding this ritual. The United Church of Canada recently produced a document that was meant to assist camp counselors and volunteers at United Church of Canada summer camps to understand who we are as a church and what we represent and what they represent as an employee at a United Church camp. It uses very simple language to outline the denomination's theology, culture, and traditions for those who may or may not be a part of the United Church as they engage in camping activities with children and with youth. It's called Who We Are, United Church Theology, Culture, and Tradition, and it describes the United Church of Canada's understanding of communion as follows. We celebrate communion, reminding us that God has come to us in Jesus to give us new life. In the words, "Do this in memory of me," there is a command for us to do as Jesus did, to pour out ourselves in compassion for the world, to allow ourselves to be transformed and brought closer to the God who loves us. A Song of Faith, which is a faith statement adopted by the United Church of Canada in 2006, looks to provide a poetical picture of what the United Church of Canada understands its faith to be in the historical, political, social, and theological context of the early 21st century. It includes the following reflection on the sacrament of communion. Carrying a vision of creation healed and restored, we welcome all in the name of Christ. Invited to the table where none shall go hungry, we gather as Christ's guests and friends. In Holy Communion, we are commissioned to feed as we have been fed, to forgive as we have been forgiven, to love as we have been loved. The open table speaks of the shining promise of barriers broken, of creation healed. In the communion meal, wine poured out and bread broken, we remember Jesus. We remember not only the promise, but also the price that he paid for who he was, for what he did and said, and for the world's brokenness. We taste the mystery of God's great love for us and are renewed in faith and in hope. Both of these documents emphasize the open call to the table and the commissioning of the gathered as a result of participating in the sacrament. This is not a mere remembrance, it is also an empowering of radical hospitality, daring justice-seeking, and an encouragement of faith. The United Church service book, Celebrate God's Presence, offers a brief history of the sacrament of communion, and here, table fellowship is remembered as an act performed by Jesus based on a ritual meal in the Jewish faith known as Passover. It's clear in its remembrance of Jesus as one who stepped beyond the bounds of what was considered proper and used the table as an image of inclusivity, hospitality, and God's inbreaking reign. Celebrate God's Presence offers a variety of prepared liturgies to celebrate the sacrament of communion. It has diverse forms, styles, and lengths of services, as well as referencing historic prayers and ecumenical versions. It provides an outline for the sacrament that is designed for the use in the creation of original or extemporaneous prayer. This suggests that built into the ethos of the United Church of Canada is permission to create and diverge from standard expressions of the Eucharist in the same way that in the early Church it was also a criterion of worship leaders that presiders be skilled at praying this form freely, yet with integrity and with substance. The service book also provides resources for prayers at table that are less formal and that allow for greater freedom in composition. The variety of resources and full prayers offered are designed to promote a fundamental concept of worship in the United Church of Canada: order and liberty. Order and liberty allow for historical substance and freshness in Eucharistic praying that appropriates the best of Christian liturgical tradition in our language and our time. To this, I would encourage an attitude of playfulness, a greater sense of joy, and a sense of greater physicality and participation. In Gathered for Worship, a source book for worship communities, leaders, and teams, Professor William S. Curvin from Emmanuel College offers some basic information about communion in the United Church. Curvin asserts a vibrant celebration of Holy Communion remains a challenge for many of our congregations. We may need to review our practices and reconsider our assumptions so that we may renew its meaning for us. Curvin also encourages us to gather gladly. He suggests that far more often our table fellowship is more like a funeral than a feast, and this comes as a remnant of medieval penitential society. Lawrence E. Stuckey concurs, noting that many Christians approach the table reluctantly and glumfully, determined not to enjoy it. Stuckey is also conscious that the feast is too often offered in unexciting ways. A playful approach to the table can still encompass reverence, can still be respectful and have deep meaning, while also allowing space for celebration and for joy. And he references several hymns that encourage us to approach the table with joy. One of the transformational resources on Eucharist that has influenced my thinking is Eucharist with a small e by Miriam Therese Winter. The author invites us to imagine spirituality rooted in the actions of Jesus in order to add a sacramental dimension to our everyday lives. She calls us to live a sacramental life rather than to celebrate a sacrament, and argues that people's ordinary lives are Eucharistic. Winter examines two fundamentally different biblical paradigms for theology and practice of the Eucharist: the Jerusalem and the Pauline models. The Jerusalem model is focused on the meals experienced in the book of Acts, celebrated with joy and expectation of the return of Jesus. These meals lacked formulaic ritual and excluded the mention of the bread and the cup. The Pauline model, developed in response to local contexts in the early church and was celebrated in memory of the death of Christ. The Pauline model established participants in the meal as members of the body of Christ by means of their eating and drinking together, and it included ritualized words. Winter argues for the adoption of the Jerusalem model, and she broadens the definition of Eucharist to include all that nourishes faith and hope or gives rise to love. In her willingness to broaden the understanding of Eucharist as well as the foundational stories for table fellowship, Winters is in agreement with Thomas O'Loughlin. O'Loughlin's exploration in Eucharist, origins and contemporary understandings, intentionally distances itself from understanding that specific theological presentations of the Eucharist can be seen as classic or held to have within itself the basis for an absolute claim to be the theology of the Eucharist. He says that there is no a priori doctrine of the Eucharist and encourages a broader look at the activity of early Christians. O'Loughlin argues it is the activity which receives primacy and not the specific words. Winters provided a helpful joining of the sacred and the secular that has great relevance for the intersection of liturgy and play. Connections can be drawn that see play as something that also nourishes and nurtures faith and hope, or gives rise to love, therefore marking it as Eucharistic. In addition, the joyfulness of the Jerusalem model leaves room for more joyful language and images in our liturgies. If we're called to be followers of Christ, then modeling our sharing of a meal around more than the Last Supper seems valid. This doesn't mean that we need to abandon beloved language of our tradition. Winter offers the Jerusalem model in addition to the traditional Pauline formulaic expression, rather than as a replacement for it, presenting a way for us to allow meal fellowship to enrich our lives beyond the sanctuary and the service. She attempts to retrieve forgotten aspects of the table fellowship of Jesus, and Stuckey would agree. He argues that the meal Jesus shared in the upper room cannot be separated from all the eating and the drinking that he did prior to this, and nor can it be separated from the meals that he shared with his followers after the resurrection. Critics of Winter may see a greater connection to the theology of discipleship rather than Eucharist or liturgy, as she emphasizes a sacramentality of daily experience. But maybe this would dishonor the proposition that Eucharist with a small e is not about rites and rituals. Stuckey offers a helpful caution, reminding us that communion liturgies cannot become chirpy optimism. They cannot fail to recognize the realities of real lives. And so the goals of a playful liturgy cannot diminish the reality of those who come to the table. The table of God must indeed deliver the good news, but must do so in ways that neither mock nor cheat those who come forward, meeting the Christ just as they are. Gordon Lathrop's thinking on liturgy as ritual, and in particular his notion of the sacred as the ordinary, supports Winter's concept of Eucharist with a small e. For Lathrop, what makes the ordinary sacred is its stylized and focused application. At the same time, Lathrop cautions that rites need to be recognizable to the participants. He says that we cannot be so creative in our approach that we lose the participants, and nor can we simply reenact the way that it always is or has been. We need to strike a balance between creativity and stagnation, and his most helpful commentary was the reminder that holy things are derived from the ordinary, simple, common, human things. You've been provided with a PowerPoint presentation on communion to help guide you as you begin to prepare your liturgies. I'll also be sending you some written documents to help you in case you need to reference some of the things that I have said in this video or in the PowerPoint. As you begin to work on your liturgies, please keep in mind the elements of play, the 6 principles of participatory worship, the exercises on vigorous verbs, and the things that we have discovered through our interviews. An evaluation tool has been provided to help you think through these components as you begin to write your liturgy. And remember, you're writing a liturgy for a typical Sunday service. You can use any of the structures that were provided: Stuckey, Duck, Celebrate God's Presence, or you can go completely freeform, but try to remember to attend to those things that don't make it too unfamiliar or too new, so that people still have the opportunity to see themselves and to see Christ in it. Thanks.